Okay, so, uh, we always get into some pretty interesting stuff, but get ready, because this deep dive is going to be a wild ride.
Yeah, this source, the myths, which we should believe, it really goes there.
It really does. And based on what you were telling me before we started recording, you're ready to tackle some pretty unbelievable ideas,
Well, you know how it is. It's one thing to talk about the things everyone already accepts.
right? Like God and angels and all that.
Exactly, the basics. But this source is asking us to consider what if some of those creatures we usually think of as purely mythological, what if they were actually real?
It's like the source is saying, okay, you think you're a believer, but are you ready to believe in this?
Yeah, it's about accepting that a core part of Christian faith is accepting the supernatural, and that can lead us to some really uncomfortable places.
And uncomfortable is putting it mildly. I mean, we're talking about creatures straight out of ancient stories here.
Right, dragons, behemoths, leviathans, unicorns. I mean, these aren't just Sunday school metaphors.
So you're saying they were real, like actually existed.
This source suggests they were real living creatures, not just symbols or stories.
See, that's where things get really interesting to me. Because, okay, maybe dragons were real. I mean, people have been finding weird bones for centuries. But then you get to something like Psalm 28.6, where it describes a unicorn as being agile. Have you ever seen a rhinoceros leap gracefully?
Yeah.
It just makes you wonder if those writing these ancient texts weren't describing something they actually believed they'd seen.
That's the heart of it, isn't it? Were these creatures simply metaphors, or did the writers truly believe they walked the earth alongside humans? And if they did exist, what does that mean for how we interpret these texts today?
It really makes you think twice about everything you think you know. And it gets even wilder because then the source goes beyond these fantastical creatures and starts talking about creatures that blur the lines between animals and humans.
Yeah, and this is where some people might start to get a little uncomfortable, even if they were on board with the idea of a literal behemoth, for example.
So what are we talking about here?
Well, the source mentions basilisks, for example, a reptile-bird hybrid. I mean, it sounds like something out of a fantasy novel.
Hold on, a bird-reptile hybrid.
Right.
Is this like some ancient ancestor of birds we're talking about or something more intentional?
That's a great question. And honestly, the source doesn't really give a definitive answer, but it does make you wonder if our understanding of the natural world, even with all our scientific advancements, might still be missing some pretty big pieces. And it gets even weirder. The source goes on to mention satyrs and centaurs.
Okay, wait, those are like classic mythology creatures, half human, half animal. Are we getting a little off topic
Well,
here?
that's the thing. This source connects these creatures to some pretty interesting interpretations of biblical texts,
Like what?
like Genesis 6 and the Book of Enoch.
Okay, now we're really getting into the weeds here. I mean, fallen angels interbreeding with humans and animals, creating these hybrid beings. It's a lot to take in.
It definitely challenges traditional interpretations, but the source presents it as a real possibility. These creatures were the result of this corruption, this twisting of creation.
And then, of course, you have the flood, this sort of cosmic reset button.
Exactly. It's like wiping the slate clean, starting over.
But if I'm remembering correctly, the source doesn't think it's quite that simple, right? I mean, it's not like everything was back to normal after the flood.
You're right. The source suggests that just like the Bible mentions giants existing after the flood, these hybrid creatures might have stuck around too. Maybe not in the same numbers, but still out there.
So, like, echoes of that time before. Okay, so we've gone from dragons and unicorns, which are fantastical but still sort of within the realm of imagination, to these hybrid creatures that are honestly a little disturbing. Where does the source go from here?
Well, it focuses on one example in particular that I found really fascinating, the cynocephaly,
The what now?
the dog-headed men.
Are we talking about St. Christopher, the patron saint of travelers?
You got it. He's often depicted with a dog's head, right? The source points to him as a potential example of a cynocephaly who converted to Christianity and was restored to his human form.
Hmm? I always thought that was just some weird artistic choice. But you're saying it might be based on something real.
That's what the source suggests. And there are other examples too. The Coptic saints, Arakas and Ogani, they're also depicted with canine features in some icons.
Coptic saints, I'm not familiar with those.
They're part of the Coptic Orthodox Church, an ancient branch of Christianity centered in Egypt. They have a rich history, and their art and iconography often depicts these dog-headed figures.
Wow, it's like these little details you never think twice about suddenly take on a whole new meaning. So are we saying that conversion to Christianity had the power to reverse these genetic anomalies to basically make these creatures human again?
It's one way to interpret it. The sauce seems to be drawing a connection between faith and transformation. And it even goes beyond these hybrid beings. There are stories like this in folklore, too.
Really? Like what did he?
Well, the source talks about fairies and little people from Irish tradition. They're often seen as demonic or bringing bad luck, right?
Okay, I have to admit fairies aren't usually part of my theological research.
Yeah.
But I'm intrigued.
Well, what's interesting is that these creatures represent a disruption of the natural order, just like the hybrid beings we were talking about. And yet within that disruption, there's this idea of potential redemption.
Redemption for fairies.
The source highlights the story of Lee Bon, a woman from Irish legend who was transformed into a mermaid.
A mermaid. Now that's just ridiculous.
I know it sounds crazy, but according to the story, she later converted to Christianity, was baptized, and took the name Morgaine. And when she died, her soul went to heaven.
Okay, so let me get this straight. We're talking about a woman who was turned into a mermaid, then became a Christian, and went to heaven.
It's a unique story, but it raises some interesting questions about the nature of these creatures and whether they have the capacity for redemption within a Christian worldview.
So we have this potential pattern emerging. These beings that are born from a disruption of the natural order, and then through faith they find solace and ultimately their true selves. So a powerful concept, I'll grant you that. But it does make you wonder if these creatures were real, and if they were redeemed or transformed through faith, why don't we see them anymore?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it? If these creatures were real, if they were really out there, what happened? It's not like we see dragons flying around or centaurs running through the forest.
It's easy to dismiss it all as mythology, as stories our ancestors told to explain the world around them. But this source makes you wonder if there's more to it than that.
Exactly. And the source talks about this idea of embracing the uncomfortable.
Yeah, I remember that part.
We live in a world that's all about easy answers and simple explanations. But faith isn't always easy or simple.
Definitely not. It's about wrestling with those big questions, even if they make us uncomfortable.
Right. And sometimes even if we don't find all the answers, the very act of searching, of grappling with those mysteries, can deepen our understanding and our faith.
It's like the source is saying, don't be afraid to ask the tough questions, even if they don't have easy answers.
Absolutely. And, when you think about it, these creatures, the dragons, the unicorns, the cynocephaly, they're often seen as being on the fringes of society, living in the shadows.
Outcasts, basically.
In a way, yeah. And maybe those who are drawn to these unconventional ideas, these unbelievable concepts within faith, maybe they're exploring those fringes too, those areas beyond the readily accepted.
So you're saying there's a connection between these creatures and the people who believe in them.
It's an interesting thought, isn't it? Both existing outside the boundaries of what's considered normal or acceptable.
But like the source said, it's often in those uncomfortable spaces, those areas beyond the ordinary, where we make the most profound discoveries about ourselves and our faith.
It's a journey of exploration, and sometimes that journey leads us to unexpected places.
So if these creatures did exist, if there's some truth to these stories, what happened to them? And what does their disappearance say about the power of belief?
Those are questions worth pondering, aren't they? It's like we've only scratched the surface of a much larger mystery.
And maybe like those ancient stories suggest, there are still mysteries hidden in the shadows waiting for us to uncover them if we're brave enough to look.
This deep dive has certainly given us a lot to think about, hasn't it?
It really has.
Yeah.
Until next time, keep asking those tough questions, and don't be afraid to venture into the unknown, because you never know what you might find.